there was a political agenda behind Darwin. It wasn't just like objective science emerging and taking over. There was always political objectives on both sides.
Hello and welcome to another Mind Matters show. Today joining us we have Matthew Ehret, journalist and owner of two websites. One is the CanadianPatriot.org and the other is the RisingTideFoundation.net. And we're very happy to see you with us today, Matthew. We have a lot that we want to talk to you about.
Yeah, it's great to be on. And like I said, I've really enjoyed your show. It's one of the few oases on the internet in the alt media world where you can get some real substantial ideas and discussions. So I really appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate you. And funny story, the Mind Matters guys were talking about your work one evening and how we'd love to sit and chat and discuss a few things with you. And lo and behold, several hours later, we saw your comment to our Ertugrul show on YouTube. And that seemed to clinch it. You know, that was the universe saying, it's time to talk to Matthew. So again, we're super happy to have you with us today to talk about Ertugrul and a whole lot of dots that you connect in history that most people are largely unaware of. I know I've been unaware of many things that I've read in your articles that we've been seeing on Sott.net and on your own website. And I thought I'd start today with one piece that just, to me, explains so much of what we're seeing today, especially in the area of science and politics. And the title of your article was How Thomas Huxley's X Club Created Nature Magazine and Sabotaged Science for 150 Years. And if anyone's ever looked at or read science journals, you'll know that Nature magazine is one of maybe 2 or 3 or 5 that are these kind of establishment bastion cornerstones of accepted science and review. And they're rather insulated and very protective of the ideas that they put forth and go on the attack towards ideas that are unorthodox or one would say are outside of the box.
Yeah.
So in the context of COVID-19, you take a look back at what you called or what was established as Thomas Huxley's X Club and the establishment of Nature magazine. And this was a very pro-Darwin philosophically establishment magazine that, as you explain in your article, was put out there as a kind of alternative to the hard power that was quite often the way that the British Empire expressed itself in the world, aggressively and overtly. And in response to Abraham Lincoln and some of his colleagues' new kind of view of the world, where there was cooperation and where universal war would not be the rule, but rather universal cooperation would be the rule. You had this group of elitists decide that they had to go about things in a different way. And I wonder if you can discuss that and kind of underscore some of the main points of that piece, because it speaks so much to how Darwinism has become this firmly entrenched, almost monolithic idea in the minds of the West and scientists, despite many ideas to the contrary. But let me stop there and let you take off in that direction, because just a wonderful piece.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting entry point. Yeah, thank you for posing the question the way you did. Yeah, indeed. A lot of people wonder sometimes, I think, how it is that certain scientific theories perpetuate themselves over many generations. And it's like there's the thinking is often, well, there must be something really true about it. Otherwise, it would have been replaced by a different theory. And that's very naive. There's very strong political agendas that often reinforce and keep certain lines of thinking or certain narratives that put our minds in a certain box by which we have to look out of that box from a filter that's very skewed to try to explain natural phenomenon, whether in physics or whether in life sciences. And Darwin, yeah, like that was one of many theories in the 19th century. And people often forget that there were other theories that were accounting for the evolution. I mean, it was becoming more and more obvious that life was not this fixed thing that just came into being, 6,000 years ago, from nothing, according to a literal biblical interpretation. There were other scientists grappling with the appearance of fossils and the obvious increase of biodiversity over time. And they were coming up with, well, what is the mechanism that would answer what makes this happen? You have people like Silliman, who ran the American scientific journals, or James Dwight Dana. Carl Ernst von Baer was a German scientist who was part of the Alexander von Humboldt network, who were all approaching this in very interesting ways, where they were all seeing, okay, well, there's obviously a directionality to evolution. There's a sort of what is the thing that decides what species disappear and which ones come into being with new attributes, new powers of organizing themselves and perpetuating their existence? Is it just random? Is it chaotic? Or is there a directionality? Is there a flow? Is there a higher design? And they were obviously of the design school, that there's an orientation towards this. It wasn't all predeterministic, but there was there was a directionality. Now, the British Imperial School of Science, well, doesn't like that. They didn't like that idea that there was a design in the world, or that there was a harmony of the parts, that the whole biosphere is organizing itself and harmonizing itself with a whole, a unifying principle in mind. They preferred to keep things in a sort of paradigm of conflict. That no, nature is if we allow for an explanation, it has to involve the idea that nature is at war with itself, and that the things that come about that replace other species that are weaker only replace them because they were more fit to survive. They had an ability to develop an attribute that allowed them to kill off the weaker, to have more sex, eat more of the food in a diminishing environment of diminishing resources, which Darwin himself admits in his autobiography that this theory is something that arose entirely by his reading of Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population. And he describes it in his own words that, it was only by reading that all of nature, and Thomas Malthus is talking about human beings, right? And he's working for the British East India Company's Haileybury School. So he's not exactly the most objective economist, but he's talking about human beings, and how his theory of population growth is that populations grow geometrically, human population, and nature's abundance and agriculture grows arithmetically, and thus, there you have these charts with the Malthusian sort of forecast that as population grows in this geometric way and the food resources grow arithmetically, at a certain point there's a forecastable collapse phase of tension that will cause the system to break down, unless an enlightened elite can come in and manage the resources, manage the population. And that's what they did with the repeal of the Corn Laws in Ireland, as a conscious effort to undermine the population of the dirty Irish that they just always, the British oligarchs always hated the Irish. And that's a whole story that goes back probably to the days of St. Patrick. And that's just another interesting story. But anyway, the Malthus had this really anti-human idea, and Darwin loved it. When he just read this thing I think he was on the Beagle when he read the essay. He was like, wow, that's it. That explains why there's all of these different phenomena in nature. And so, his ideas didn't really get off the ground. Like, people were kind of disgusted, even amongst the British aristocracy, which was still very Anglican. They had a lot of religious attributes to the British elite itself, mm-hmm. which made them somewhat weak. It was recognized that these attributes of having Christianity embedded in your organizing structure, even though they didn't really follow Christian principles, it was recognized that politically and pragmatically, this was not expedient because these principles in the Bible, if you actually read the Bible, you start realizing that your way of doing things as a globally extended empire, whether it's the destruction of Irish or the undermining of the Chinese through opium wars or the killing and controlled mass famines in India, these were all necessities of empire that were antagonistic, obviously, to the Bible and to principles of the New Testament. So that was something that certain figures, certain intellectual figures within the British intelligentsia realized had to be expunged and replaced with a more compatible religion that didn't have any pesky problems like the divine or a moral natural law. And so that, Darwin's theory fit the bill really nice. But again, as I said, even amongst the British aristocracy, there was a lot of pushback. There was something wrong. And also the Darwinian mechanism of random mutations on the small, that ultimately everything was governed by just these little mutations within the species were just randomly just changing. And every once in a while it was like rolling dice, and sometimes you'd get, you get 2 6s and you get lucky and all of a sudden you get like a bigger claw.
Yeah, or you get like 6 billion 6s. It's like...
Yeah. So, they didn't like these things, rightfully so. They were very offensive to natural reason. But Thomas Huxley, who was he was a cynical, misanthropic guy who went through his own, he wasn't part of the upper class. He wasn't part of a rich bloodline or anything, but he had creativity. He had to work as a surgeon's assistant, dealing with syphilis patients for years in the London ghettos. And he developed a really, really unhealthy hate for humanity. He became a little unkiltered. But he was very creative and he was a very funny guy, very witty. And he started making, there's like certain people saw his talent. Certain people are like, okay, we can use this guy. He's got things we don't have. They were getting a little bit lazy and encrusted in their comfort zone for a few too many generations, So they had lost some of the creative edge that they needed in the face of the growth of republics and the growth of the love of democracy that had just recently spread in the wake of the American Revolution around the world. So people were getting ideas of independence that they didn't have before, and they were willing to sort of fight for higher ideals that didn't bother the empire before 1776. So that required a higher order of thinking. And so as Huxley became increasingly rewarded with higher positions of influence, he was made a leader within the British Royal Academy of Sciences, and he set up a battle plan to get, using the control of collaborative media. They created a lot of public debates with religious fanatics of the Anglican Church who were trying to defend the literal interpretation of the Bible. And they knew that their arguments were, Huxley knew that these guys had really lame arguments, but set up these public debates between himself, usually defending the Darwinian view. Darwin himself had no social skills. He would not be trusted to go out in public and argue his own case. So Huxley was the guy who was usually called his bulldog. Yeah. And, it would be covered by the media in a very strict way. They knew the outcome. Huxley was going to make fun of them, destroy their arguments. And ultimately, people were led to believe that, I have to either be a creationist or I have to be naturally a scientific Darwinist. I can't, there's nothing else. And they just pumped this for a few years. And it increasingly worked. But they still only had popular media on their side. They didn't have much else. And so they created, at a certain point, Huxley created a group called the X Club. That's actually their name. They started sort of a dining club that met once a month or so with different misanthropic scientists from various fields who from you had Tyndall represent this, physics. Matthew Arnold was a frequent guest. Herbert Spencer was a frequent guest, the guy who later came up with social Darwinism, which was always there anyway. It was called Malthusianism before that, and then they just changed the name and called it social Darwinism, and then eugenics under Francis Galton later on, Darwin's cousin. but all of these, there's about 12 or so of these characters who were mainstays, and their idea was, okay, it's not enough just to have the media convincing certain people. We need to enshrine this theory as a real scientific doctrine that's indisputable. And so they created Nature magazine, coming out of that as sort of the tool that to this very day is sort of the peer review standard of truth, that if you get published in Nature, that is as good as gold as far as like the new gospel is concerned. And it's it's irrefutable at that point. You're untouchable if you get there, or so they want to project. I mean, that's the idea, is control people's perception. So I think that in short, we could talk more and unpack this, but that was sort of the origin of Nature magazine. Yeah.
Well, I've got a follow-up on a couple of things that you said in there. First was, so this Malthusianism and Darwinism into social Darwinism, you correct me if I'm wrong, you basically said this was a necessity of basically keeping around the empire, keeping around imperialism, because of the conflict with the actual Christian values that were supposed to have upheld the empire. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Like the very existence of, like, Britain wasn't always an empire. Okay. Like, Britain at first, if you go back to like Henry VII, in the end of the 15th century, he was really an anti-imperialist. He was, he took over from Richard III. Richard III was a real cretin. But at this time, this is a Britain that was not the world financial center of the world. The city of London was a negligible part of world politics. And really he was an admirer of King Louis XI, the founder of the first modern nation state. And Louis XI and Henry VII, who followed after him in that tradition, were firm believers that to be a Christian king, you had to be the instrument of God's will on earth, that you were a servant to your people. And so the legal reforms, the political economic reforms that were conducted under their reign, and also the crackdown on corruption in both of the countries, was astounding. Both of the leaders were they worked really hard for peace treaties to get out of these controlled wars that were being funded by a certain international clique of financiers. And they both turned their treasuries from war chests into engines for what's called cameralism, or later what was called dirigism, which was the investments into canals, schools, the teaching of orphans to read, internal improvements. So that was understood to be, money had to be increasingly understood as a servant of the interests of the people, instead of the interests of an imperial class. So that tradition unfortunately was undermined, and I'm going to bring it back. I'm not trying to deflect from your question. I just some important content.
Yeah, I'm seeing it.
The Henry VII's kid, unfortunately, wasn't such a good student of Thomas More. Like, Thomas More was a really great human being, as was his friend Erasmus, and many of these humanists operating within that environment in a leading position. You could read their writings and their letters, and they're really, very politically astute unto the nature of the cultural warfare of empire, how to oppose it, and Henry VIII was unfortunately targeted for an operation of deconstruction. He was psychologically worked on, his passions inflamed. He was given access to basically people like Francisco Zorzi, the advisor to Henry VIII, who became sort of his marriage counselor, was a Venetian monk and a very slimy operative. He was a leading Rosicrucian mystic, actually, at the time, who was really, really satanic. And this guy was the guy who organized, Henry VIII to marry Anne Boleyn and to get rid of Catherine of Aragon. And all of these things involved him just turning into a bit of a sex-crazed maniac. He lost his bearings. He lost his moral principles. He killed Thomas More, when Thomas More resisted his desire to get a divorce and remarry, which had deep political ramifications. He cut off Thomas More's head, and others too. Others had their lives sacrificed because they were trying to revive the Henry VII traditions. And there was a fight for the next 150 years, whether Britain was going to be a bastion of humanistic principles, or whether it was going to be taken over by the Venetian oligarchy, which at that time had worked very hard to crush the humanist movement in the Netherlands, which had developed a very strong humanist fight against the Spanish Habsburg Empire. I mean, Friedrich Schiller's Don Carlos gets at that in that story. So the fight of republicanism against empire, and this was something that was really, the Netherlands was a bastion. That's also why I think you have so many great scientists and artists emerging out of there in the 1600s. But that was first worked on and crushed when the Venetian groups, these families that were sort of just carryovers from the Roman Empire's ruling empire, the ruling oligarchy. After the Roman Empire collapsed, those families just sort of, morphed and moved, doing the same thing but under a new costume in Venice, and also parts of Byzantine. But so at that time, they had to crush. They were always like smothering out these like growing fires of independence movements that were growing in steam. And so when they set up the Bank of Amsterdam as the world's sort of first private central bank in 1609, that was sort of part of their corruption, their takeover of smothering out the fires in the Netherlands, which continued on. I mean, people like Rembrandt were really trying to fight against this corruption in his time, 80 years later. So was Christian Huygens' father, who was a governor of the Netherlands and a sponsor of Rembrandt and a painter unto himself. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. So when the time came at around the 1700 period, when Jonathan Swift became a leading advisor to the government of Robert Harley, who was the prime minister under Queen Anne, there was a major fight for about a decade over whether they were going to permit the Glorious Revolution, the sort of Dutch Venetian takeover of Britain that happened in 1688. So they moved from, after taking control of the Netherlands, they then moved to take control of Britain in that sort of way. And there was a fight against that to try to keep Britain in an anti-imperial sort of mode. And they did that by creating an anti-Bank of England, because Bank of England was set up in 1694, right? Modeled on the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609. So it was the same private central banking model of using debt slavery, usury to try to get your enemies into a cage, and just increasingly create speculation that had already taken over. Amsterdam was known as the speculative capital of the world, and soon that became London under the South Sea Bubble. But so Robert Harley, Jonathan Swift, Daniel Defoe as well was a part of this network who did Robinson Crusoe. He wrote, they were all co-architects of the National Land Bank, which was created 2 years after the Bank of England. And it was done, when you read the legislation that these guys wrote, it was all done to encourage the investments into manufactures, into canals, internal improvements, once again, instead of wars with the Netherlands or wars with France. Actually, it was more wars with France. It was Britain and the Netherlands against France most of the time, or Spain. So that land bank would have worked. The problem was it was undermined and turned into a speculative instrument that was that became part of the South Sea Bubble later on, that exploded, in 1720. Isaac Newton was a part of that, who lost his entire fortune speculating, while he was also the secretary of the Mint of the Bank of England. Then that's just, so you start seeing that there's the people that we didn't think played a very big role in universal history, like, Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Daniel Defoe, on the other side of the coin, Isaac Newton, or his enemy, Leibniz, because these were scientists. People think of these guys as like the inventor of the calculus. They don't realize that, no, Isaac Newton
were political.
Very, very political, very, very controlled instruments. I mean, he was a sociopathic narcissist who controlled the mint of the Bank of England and put thousands of people to death for counterfeiting coins. After England stole massive amounts of money from people during the Coinage Act, where they basically took all your coins, and then, because anyway, there was certain. That's a whole other story. I realize that I don't want to open up too many cans of worms. So anyway, they were very political, these people. And just like Darwin, there was a political agenda behind Darwin. It wasn't just like objective science emerging and taking over. There was always political objectives on both sides. And a lot of when Britain became more consolidated as an empire, and that identity after the Jonathan Swift, Robert Harley factions lost out and Queen Anne died. Actually, as a side note, Queen Anne's death in 1714. I was just reading. I wrote an article on this on the art of political lying a few weeks ago. I think you guys even published it on Sott. Queen Anne. It was all of the evidence points to the fact that she was likely poisoned to death, and her physician at the time, her lead physician was Daniel Malthus, the grandfather of Thomas Malthus, who would have been the guy who orchestrated her poisoning. So that's another thing. So her death really resulted in the destruction of the anti-imperial movement in Britain, and at that point, they was sort of always downhill. And the problem was the Christian traditions were always antagonistic to the behavior, the practical behavior of the empire to destroy manufacturers, to keep the world subjugated and impoverished and ignorant. In order just to keep your system alive. They couldn't, the very existence of intelligent, self-governing, sovereign individuals in the world that you were trying to dominate wouldn't permit for the types of absurd, immoral customs and laws of empire to maintain themselves. People would naturally question, like, why are we destroying our food crops for speculative purposes? Like, shouldn't we maybe not do that instead? And they would fight to stop it if they were thinking, and they weren't induced to reduce their identities to a status of live in the moment, bestialism, which is why the empire always promoted certain types of cultural movements in the arts, in the music, in literature, in fiction, whatever else, everything that tunes and awakens our passions. They wanted a very specific type of cultural matrix to dominate their victims, which cut out the actualization of what it means to be human. So by the time the 19th century was rolling around, the empire was making a lot of mistakes. There was a lot of internal resistance. Many people within the British House of Lords, they wanted, they had passed motions in the House of Lords to get rid of slavery, to disband as an empire, to let the colonies go free. Like there were real, actual, legitimate fights going on in the inner sanctum. And that was unacceptable. They needed the empire to be coherent with itself. And so I would say the thing with Nature magazine, just to go back to that quickly, is that it involved not just the Darwinian theory being ingrained, but they needed to take every domain of harmonics, physics, astrophysics, and these different people who were participants of the X Club each represented leading aspects of each of the different schools of thought, and they needed to integrate it into a new unifying holistic system where none of the parts would be incompatible with the other parts, including the political economy side of things, which is where ultimately things like radical empiricism in the sciences became promoted. The idea that your senses, all scientific fact has to be reduced to sensory data. Now, science never evolved that way. If you actually look at the history of science, it always evolved when people would have to obviously use their senses, but the discovery was never located in the deductive or inductive mode of reasoning located with the senses jumping back to abstract thinking or anything. It was always when you leapt outside of that with eurekas. Into real discovery concepts, and then transmitted that back metaphorically through your writings, through your speech, to other minds that would then awaken the idea, which was more than the logical sum of the parts of the details of the descriptive component. So the descriptive empirical sciences sort of emerged out of that.
Matthew, let me interrupt you real quickly because you did have a piece some time ago about Einstein and a few other, maybe it was Bohm or a physicist, and you made the point that some of these heavy hitters were also musicians, and if I'm remembering correctly, it's a while back, and that it speaks to this point you've just made about them using other parts of their minds in order to come to their ideas and mapping of reality, and I regret that I didn't reread the article, but it was fascinating because you you kind of established well how that works. How when you try and reduce everything to a certain way of thinking, you're leaving out whole portions of the ability to come to some understanding through science. Could you expand a little bit on that? Do you remember that piece?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it was Einstein, right? Who, because I used the two case studies in that particular article. I think it was called "The Plasma Universe" and "A Return to Max Planck's Musical Space-Time."
Yeah.
And yeah, I used the case studies of Max Planck and Albert Einstein, who, yeah, together they were both musicians. They both would actually play music together. Max Planck was a concert. He could have been a concert pianist. And really, he describes how the thing that kept him in physics was one of his teachers at, I think it was at Jena, I forget which university, but one of his teachers basically told him, yeah, go, become a pianist. You're really good. And honestly, in physics, there's nothing left to really discover. It's just sort of ironing out the details. And Max Planck, he was like, no, there's no way that everything can be discovered. There's no way. And that's what got under his skin. And he's like, I'm going to prove him wrong, and I'm going to make a discovery. And he obviously went with he was looking at black body radiation, and there were certain paradoxes that were arising in the black body. You know, when you would heat a black body of metal, usually as the heat increased, light started increasing through, and different colors. As the heat increased, there was different colors being emitted by the black body, as you see on your heating element, you know. And the hotter it got, it went from, like, you know, orange to yellow to white, and then into the blues. And then at a certain point, it just disappeared. It stopped increasing. Rather than increasing the colors, you had sort of a drop off. And he's like, why does it drop off? Does it just stop there? So you have like this increase, and then all of a sudden it just decreases in the light spectrum. And you're like, why is that? Why isn't it just increasing forever? And so he's put himself to work figuring that out. And the whole idea of the quantum of action, that there's like little packets of what he called harmonic oscillators. He didn't attribute them the way people often describe the photons today. He didn't think of it as like a particle of light, which is why people often say, oh yeah, Isaac Newton, he was right. Light really does travel in little individual particles. He didn't think of it that way. He called them harmonic oscillators. There was like a certain idea of energy flux density in there. So you had both a wave aspect of light, you know, that in all directions, 360 degrees, as you move away from a source of light, you had a reduction of the intensity of that in sort of a wave flow. Yes, that was true, but you also had these individual packets as well. Again, the idea of harmonic oscillators, I think, is an interesting idea of frequencies. So he created a new field of science that came out of that, and Einstein helped work very closely with him to understand what is really going on. And they would play music together. So, and Einstein was a violinist, you know, and together, when they would both describe in their own words that whenever they couldn't answer the problem mathematically that they were putting their minds to over many days and weeks and months, they would often go to their instruments and play Mozart. They would play Beethoven. Einstein couldn't handle Beethoven so much, but they would play Mozart together. And by then, after a few hours of doing this, just going back to the equations, answers, problems would be solvable. Their minds would be in a different space-time, right? So they'd be able to look at it from a new sort of vision and answer the problems. And they're not alone. Like, there's a lot of scientists that have similar descriptions, and it was more understood in the 19th century. Like the physics department at Jena University, they had instruments for all the physicists. That was just something that it was sort of understood, that if you want to be creative and productive in your scientific thinking, you had to develop, not had to, I mean, it was a desire. The word had and must, it wouldn't work if it was like a Kantian, I have to do this, and thus, you know, thus
encouraged.
Encouraged. Yeah, exactly.
And it seems like that's naturally, it's a view of the mind and of the world that is totally lacking nowadays, or maybe not completely, but it's lacking in the materialist Darwinist kind of mainstream mindset. The idea, but it makes perfect sense when you step outside of that when you're engaging in a musical activity, for instance, you're you're tuning into something. You're wanting to, like David Lynch would put it, catch the fish, right? There's this fish out there in the ether, in the whatever it is, and when you're creative, when you're looking for something, it's an idea that comes to you. And I've played guitar for years. I went to school for it, and that's the way I kind of look at it too. Is it, and a lot of musicians look at it like that. That they're not. If you ask them, well, who wrote this song? Sometimes they'll say, well, I didn't even write this song. I think who was it? One of the Beatles, was it John Lennon? Which song was it? Was it Yesterday?
Yeah.
Because we watched that movie yesterday, which was pretty fun. But he woke up one day. No, we watched the movie yesterday some time ago. Have you seen that one, Yesterday? It's a fun kind of like rom-com with where the Beatles don't exist and he remembers all their songs. But anyways, Yesterday, I'm pretty sure that was the song where he woke up with the song in his head and just wrote it down. Basically, he didn't consciously put it together and compose it. Mm-hmm. It came to him, and it doesn't always work like that, right? So not all writers or artists have that moment of complete inspiration where it comes, completed and whole. But there's something to that process where you're kind of opening up your mind to be able to receive something wherever it's from. There's all kinds of theories about what's going on in the subconscious and what the nature of the mind is, and you can argue about that. But there's an aspect of inspiration to this, and intuition to this process of, like you said, like putting ideas together. When you get the gestalt, when you get when you have that eureka flash, and so just with that kind of understanding, which you should get from just life experience, just living, that, okay, you've got a bunch of scientists, a bunch of physicists trying to figure stuff out. Well, get them in the mindset that, in the state of mind, maybe, where you're receptive, where you're being creative, where things are being put together and recombined and composed, like, as you say, like in a different space-time on some other level.
Yeah.
And then that will translate. It will translate into that other domain.
Yeah. Absolutely, and play is key, right? Friedrich Schiller, the great. I mean, I mentioned Don Carlos, the history play that was written by Friedrich Schiller, who's known in Germany as the poet of freedom, and like all of his plays and all of his aesthetical theories, like his aesthetical letters, he's always getting at, like, how do you resolve the seeming contradiction between us being a society, a spontaneous society, like we have our emotional state, and we have this logical side of ourselves. And if a society is organized with a disequilibrium where it's, too much, he uses certain like politically incorrect language, but if you have a society of what he calls the barbarians running the show, which he characterized as the problem with the French Revolution was that it was a society where you had a barbarian culture in the elites. So that he defined as being a society which is too ivory tower, too in their own heads in the abstract world, where people say like, oh yeah, I love humanity, but I hate people, because they love the idea, the idea of humanity, but they actually they haven't cultivated their own internal emotions. They can't actually talk to people, or care about them. So you had that sort of stratification in the elite, which had access to education and to culture and other things. And then you had what he calls the savage culture in the masses, where people were never given access to education or a development of their intellectual identities. And so they were a society where the masses just lived in the pursuit of survival moment to moment. And so you had this sort of disequilibrium in that society that resulted in a complete devastating bloodbath in the case of the French Revolution, which started off hopefully, for the first couple of months, there was hope that it could be a successful Republican revolution in France. But very quickly, all of the leading scientists who actually had a development of both their minds and their hearts together and harmonized, like Lavoisier, people who had been working with Benjamin Franklin, they all found themselves on the chopping block. And, the banner of the French Revolution quickly became the Révolution doesn't need scientists. And they just killed like all of their leading scientists and statesmen and astrophysicists who were also part of the Republican movement to get rid of monarchical systems of control. So Schiller's writings, he gets at the importance of play. that the way to get out of this problem is to awaken the play instinct. And he makes the point that a man can't really truly be a man if he does not play, and you can't play unless you're a man. And that's the thing that the Kantians are incapable of getting at, because Kant says, yeah, you should do good. You should do your duty, but ultimately you can't ever really want to do your duty. It's just something you should do as a categorical imperative. And when Schiller read that, and Schiller's allies like the Humboldts, Alexander von Humboldt and Wilhelm von Humboldt, the educational reformers of Germany, who were also part of this group, they were all horrified. They're like, no, the Kantian system destroys our ability to understand the natural role of play, of irony. This is where the thing that inspires people into moving their minds on their own free will and making eurekas, you're destroying that by getting people to just like do good because you should do good, you must. Mm-hmm. And Schiller makes the point, no man must. And I think music and arts, painting, things like that, they get you into that state of mind where you're just having fun, right? And it frees you from the shackles of your logical part of yourself. And so then you could play with the logic. You could look for the cracks in the logic. Where do if I'm trying to make a discovery of something, obviously that discovery in science exists outside of the domain of the logical language that I'm utilizing, because that logical language is the composite of everything that's only been discovered up until my moment now. But I'm trying to discover something outside of there. So how do I make that leap, right? And so I've got to take my language, my logical language, whether it's that's very descriptive, and then look for where does it break down when I map it onto reality? Where are the cracks? And those cracks become the paradoxes, the ironies that become more interesting than all of the generic data is less important than where are those ironies. And in the case of, like, for example, if you want a concrete example of that, I think a great one is Kepler. When Kepler, Johannes Kepler, the guy who discovered certain laws of planetary motion, like the elliptical nature of the orbits, or the equal area and equal time law, or the third law, which was a harmonic law that we sort of descriptively after the fact called his, that there's a constant in all of the planet's motion, that there's the cube of the mean distance from each planet to the sun has a certain relationship to the square of the periodicity of each orbit. So there's a certain cube to square relationship of each planet within the solar system as a whole. And he discovered that over the course of 20 years. But the thing that allowed him to get his entry point into that was looking at the paradox of the retrograde motion of Mars. And so every single sort of standard model, descriptive standard model of planetary motion available to him that you had to adopt if you were going to be a respected scientist in his day, every single one of those models adopted certain common assumptions which chose to just explain away the retrograde motion of Mars. You guys know what the retrograde motion of Mars was or is?
No. Tell us, please.
It's when you go back and look at the night sky, and obviously Mars jumps out because it's the only sort of red star. And if you take a snapshot at the same time every night, Mars is at a different position, right? Mm-hmm. And every 687 days, the interesting thing is that motion of Mars all of a sudden stops at let's say it's 8 o'clock at night, right? It all of a sudden stops. The next night, all of a sudden it's the same place. The next night, it's all of a sudden going backwards again. The next night, it's going backwards again. And for 2 weeks, it goes backwards before stopping again and then continuing back on its track for the next 687 days, which it does, and 687 days later, almost 2 years later, you can go back, and now it's at the retrograde happens a slightly different direction, maybe, 2 degrees further to the, let's say, left or right, whichever direction you're looking at, southern or northern hemisphere, right? But it all of a sudden happens at a different spot in the night sky. And they were all explaining, all of the scientists were saying, okay, the way we're going to account for this phenomenon is by just putting epicycles onto our model. And so, you had your, you got your sun in the middle, you got the planetary orbit, which is, everyone said it had to be circles, couldn't be anything but circles. And because circles, God made the universe and God is perfect, and circle is the most perfect of all shapes. So everything must be circles, which I by habit, I did like an oval, but anyway. And so what they basically said is let's say, if this is Mars's orbit, then what we're going to do is we're going to put a little secondary cycle around an invisible point that is going around, and imagine this whole thing is a circle, okay? It's going around the sun, and that Mars is going to be on this little secondary small orbit going around at a constant motion. This is going around at a constant motion. And by doing this, Mars would then have this sort of, there'd be this sort of pathway charted out by Mars's motion over time around the sun. And there were different variations on that, whether it was Tycho Brahe's version or whether it was Ptolemy's version or Copernicus's version. They all had a different configuration where they all obeyed equal constant motion, cycles upon cycles that are called epicycles with little equants that are these like invisible points around which everything moves in equal distance, equal speed. And Kepler's like, well, that's a lot of add-ons that God had to create in our solar system. If every planet is doing this in different proportions, that's a lot of absurd, unnecessary stuff that's been created just to account for this thing you're visually seeing. He's like, is there not a simpler, more elegant answer to this? Which this is where the opening, by proving that there was like an ontological paradox, like an impenetrable, the logic of this system of description totally broke down at a certain point. And that break, that paradox that people couldn't run away from, allowed him then to introduce a higher hypothesis, which took the form of, well, maybe it's not circles, right? Maybe it's ellipses, which are just sort of slivers of a cone, a conic section. And then that allows us now to move our minds in a totally different domain. And he's very playful. The guy's poetic. So if you read Kepler's writings, he's a poet. And that's why he calls his book, it's a beautiful book. You can even order it. It's been 400 years it took him to actually translate this into English, but you can order the Harmonies of the Worlds online. And really something, but it's entirely based on a musical hypothesis. So he's like, is it possible that there's a musical coherence in all of the planetary motions and the distance? Like, why are all the planets moving around the sun at these different intervals where they are? Is it just random, or is there a higher musical coherence and reason? And which he, by the way, he discovers the third law by proving that that's so. That's why he called it this and not the disharmony. And he does it politically. He's actually dedicating this to James the First. That's on the dedication page, who he's trying to persuade as a new king of England. Now he's in Germany, but England, as I said, there's this fight to keep England from becoming an empire. And James the First is being induced to take on an imperial sort of modus operandi, declaring unnecessary wars all over the place. And he's like, well, and Kepler is writing this right before the 30 Years' War really kicks off. Actually, the 30 Years' War has at this point begun. This is 1620. And his father dies. His father was a mercenary in the 30 Years' War it killed half of Germany. Half of Germany died in the 30 Years' War. Like the whole Black Forest was wiped out. It was like brutal, like Aleppo today, in the light of that, his way of intervening on that is to go into astrophysics and try to prove that the universe is harmonic, and then to persuade the different kings and different puppet leaders that you're doing things all wrong. Like it's not just the Bible that says we're made in God's image, but it's provable that God made us in his image because I discovered a part of God's mind by looking into my own mind. And, there's this coherence scientifically. And he's like, okay, so there's obviously political ramifications to this being true, And I think that if you look at a lot of the great scientists like Benjamin Franklin, he was talking about, Kepler or Ben Franklin's teacher like Cotton Mather or John Winthrop. They were all scientists in the pre-revolutionary period in Europe, and they were all studying Kepler, translating Kepler.
Is that it?
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah, no, sorry. I was going to jump in and say something because you've said like so much and a lot of it is just really interesting. No, it's great. Like you are, super knowledgeable, and you can tie in everything together in this beautiful harmony. which is something that strikes me about a lot of these different theories of whatever it is. We'll take natural selection and random mutation as but one example, where you start off with a kind of absurd premise, and then in order to justify it, you have to come up with an even more absurd premise. And then in order to justify that, you just have to keep going with even more and more absurd premises where, in order at this point for them to continue justifying natural selection and random mutation, because we know that mathematically speaking, it's impossible for those things to be true. But the way that they get around it is by saying, oh, we just happen to live in the one universe in however many trillion where everything has gone perfectly right such that we are here and everything's gone that way. And like I was just saying, it's just building upon absurdities to just an unbelievable degree when really it's a lot simpler and a lot more elegantly beautiful than that, I think.
Those are exactly like the epicycles. That's exactly the same thing. Over thousands of years, they were just finding ways of putting more and more epicycles to the point that Copernicus' system, which technically has the sun in the center, it's only technically, you could remove the sun from Copernicus's model and nothing changes because everything's not really moving around the sun. It's actually moving around a spot a few thousand miles from the sun. Yeah. There's like this invisible mathematical equant that he makes his whole system work around. So, and then from there, if you look closer at the Copernican system, there's not just one, but there's like 4 different epicycles and sub-epicycles on Mars's motion. So Mars is going around one invisible circle, which is going around another invisible circle, which is going around another invisible circle, which is going around the sun, which is not really the sun. It's a spot next to the sun. So it's like they're just keeping, because as your data becomes more refined and you get more evidence and more information on where the actual positions and distances are of the planets, the more it proves that you're out of whack, like your model doesn't work. So you have to just either change your model the way Kepler does, or if you're lazy or dishonest, simply add more absurd layers and epicycles, which is what the Darwinians have done.
And that is another thing
too, right? If you actually look at the global warming models, not that long ago, it was becoming, people were accepting the fact that the global warming sort of stopped about 14 years ago in 2001 or so. It sort of like started tapering off. Now they've tried to start change the Google searches so you can't even find that data for some reason. But anyway, they were accepting that for a while. And I actually had climate scientists come up to me, and I was talking to them, and they were like, yeah, you didn't know that the cooling is caused by the warming? It's like, whoa, you wouldn't have said that 5 years before you just said that. Like, what are you talking about?
No, exactly. It's only later on when they have incontrovertible evidence that they can't just dismiss away. Like, it's in their face now. They have to deal with it. And so the only way they can deal with it is still by kind of like brushing it aside in this weird and absurd way that doesn't make any rational sense and wouldn't have fit in their original like premises. Like, they had to come up with something totally new and irrelevant or irrational.
Well, that's just how people are, right? This is one of the things we kind of do on our show, is to bring it, sometimes we'll get into specifics, like we'll talk about politics a bit, but then we try to bring it down to like psychology or philosophy or something, like just on a kind of a different level. It's like in interpersonal relationships, when you've got a strong belief about something or a strong interpretation about an event that has happened, maybe an emotional encounter that you've had with your significant other or someone or a family member, and then you get called on it, and then you just keep coming up with excuses, and they become more ridiculous and more ridiculous as you dig yourself deeper into the hole, right? And and that's just what we see, like in all these scientific theories, is just that very basic element of interpersonal relationships and psychology, just in the public domain, in the scientific domain. And like, if you read the emails that scientists send each other, they sound like toddlers just getting in fights over things, right? They can be completely rude to each other and just not listen and swear at each other. And like, if you look behind the scenes at scientists, it's like, it's kind of like seeing your parents naked when you're a little kid. It's like, you don't want to see it because it's very uncomfortable, and it shatters so many illusions that you've had about them. So, but every once in a while, it's necessary just to kind of show that these people, there's nothing great about scientists
Nothing
necessarily.
magical.
There are some great scientists, right? Just like there are some like total inspirations that are total geniuses, and but most of the guys that you'll see on TV and the people that are holding up the mainstream view of things are just, when it comes down to it, they're pretty average on so many other levels. And when you see all of these epicycles in the theorizing, and like to the point where, as a result of developments in biology and in microbiology, the argument gets to the point, like you said, Adam, where you have to say, oh, well, there are actually an infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be in the one where this happens, which isn't an explanation for why things happened here, right? You can use that as an explanation for anything. It may be true that there are an infinite number of universes, but it doesn't explain. It can't be an explanation, because it's not an explanation. It just says, oh, well, this must have happened. It's like, well, how was this cup made? Well, I must be in the universe where this cup just happened to be here. Well, no, there was actually, there was a way in which it happened, and there are reasons for why every step in the process did happen. But well, anyways,
the example, imagine you had, how did the cake come into being? Oh, well, I had all these ingredients in my hand. I fell down the stairs, and by the time I got to the bottom of the stairs, I had a cake. Well, maybe, sure, you could explain something away like that, but it's really absurd. It's lazy-mindedness to a very high degree, for sure.
And then with that, trying to bring things together in a way, you have two kind of, well, maybe multiple avenues here, but one of them being a more nefarious-minded group. So like the X group, who had a very clear goal in mind, which was to further empire, right? So that's, got a great influence on society and where things go. And so we have to keep that in the back of our minds as to why things play the way that they do. And then there's also the human, just natural human aspect, like you were saying, Harrison, with just, the problems of people getting emotionally attached to ideas or outcomes, or being roused or what have you. And so it becomes a really big mess, because, again, on the one hand, you have the people who are trying to control things for, individual gain. And then there's just, people not wanting to be wrong. And so it creates this mess. And the way I kind of want to tie this together is...
It's all in Ertugrul.
Exactly. That's exactly where I was going.
Wait, before you go there, because I want to go there. Okay. But I was just thinking about something that I didn't want to lose, that touched on what we were just saying about the whole, luckily we existed in this part, the formula was just right in our little part of the universe, and so life came about and just happened to be the way it is. But that's one of the problems too with the entire 20th century has really been derailed, because we brought up Max Planck and Einstein. They were mocked in their lifetime for being of the old generation who denied the new discoveries of the Copenhagen School of Quantum Mechanics. And this is the school around Niels Bohr and Max Heisenberg, that basically they said, okay, the way that we're going to resolve the new paradoxes that were emerging in the quantum was by solving it through the assumption of randomness. So just like Darwin sort of solved the problem of why species come about through the idea of random mutation and so obviously it's this invisible wall beyond which your mind can't transgress. They said the same thing now for the atom. And we're just going to say that there's a randomness function going on the small. And this is where people sort of misunderstand why Einstein and also Planck said God doesn't play dice with the universe. They didn't want it. They couldn't accept. They're like, maybe there's another set of organizing principles that you just haven't discovered yet, because you're not being very creative, and you're just running away from that fact by just creating another mechanism of randomness. And statistical probability theory sort of just became the tool that was used to describe where an electron might be, where a photon might be, because obviously you can't, as soon as you try to see something like a photon, the very act of seeing it requires that a photon hit the photon to jump back to your eye to be absorbed, into whatever apparatus you're measuring it with, which causes it to move. So you can't know the position plus the momentum of it. You can only know maybe one of the two, and even that imperfectly. So rather than make a discovery, a whole new system that became known as the standard model of cosmology on the large, or the standard model of quantum theory on the small. It's pretty much the same thing, where they tried to absorb Einstein's relativity and absorb Planck's constant into their explanatory system, but denying the principle of creative thought and musical thought that gave birth to those very ideas that they then wanted to use and put in its own little cage. But trillions of dollars and godless hours
The shoe fits.
of
Godless
time
hours.
and energy have been pulled into building bigger and bigger tests using particle accelerators and it's great that we have these particle accelerators and CERN, and it's all great that we have these machines that are out there that can get us empirical data by smashing things together. But they've put years of work into pursuing things like the God particle, which they finally discovered, I think, in like 2012 or 2011. They discovered the God particle, and this is supposed to be the particle that was going to like explain how mass exists, how does coherence exist. And they're like, finally, we got it. They smashed things together just the right velocity, and they found something bounce off of the explosion that they then were like, okay, that is the thing. And it's like, what changed? What power of discovery did that give you? Nothing changed. And part of this whole thing was that they don't want to accept Kepler's discovery of the harmony of the universe, which came before Newton. So 80 years before Newton came up with his laws that he called gravity. And Newton is very much like a Darwin character in this whole story. Newton was a bit of a black magician, autistic character who was a sociopath and a political agent, kind of like a composite of sort of like a Barack Obama character. Like there's nothing really there behind the hologram. It's like a composite of impulses and desire for sex. It's nothing. but you look at where the discoveries that we attribute to Newton, like gravity, where did they actually come from? And the gravitational equations of the inverse square law are all directly derivable from Kepler's discoveries, from Kepler's equations, mixed in with a little bit of Huygens's work on centrifugal motion, including, and also one of Kepler's leading defenders, Gottfried Leibniz, who discovered the calculus based on a challenge that Kepler threw out to future generations of mathematicians to discover how do you create a language of nonlinear change. Because, with the elliptical orbits, you have like change happening at every moment in the orbits. There's no constants. So how do you create a language of that type of nonlinear changeness that happens with all curvature in physical space-time? And so Leibniz took the challenge up a few decades later and succeeded. All of these things, like the calculus, are attributed to Newton for some reason, and gravity is attributed to Newton and his work on optics. Which, so again, the people who made the discoveries were not Newton. They all happened way before Newton did. So there's obviously, again, political objectives to hollow out those discoveries, to destroy the idea of the harmony of their minds, the musicality of their minds, and then just allow only the descriptive shell to remain that you could then maybe use, but you can't improve upon. You can't get insight into the nature of the universe that way, or the nature of your mind. Mm-hmm. So the God, if you were to approach things today in quantum physics the way that Einstein or Planck, who are both followers of Kepler, they both write about their understanding of Kepler, they read his writings, they fought to get people to also study it, which their followers refused to do, unfortunately. Very few of them did. It wouldn't be a paradox why there is such a thing as mass. You wouldn't need to pursue hitting particles together to explode them to get the God particle, because Kepler didn't have an idea of gravity as such. He had an idea of coherence. Why is there universal coherence? What are the harmonic intervals, right? And what are the purposes of the disharmonies? He also has a special role for the dissonances, things that sometimes people call the devil's interval of, like, fa sharp and do. There's certain keys that just they don't resonate well. We know scientifically later, like now, why on one level those wavelengths are interfering with each other, but they just also they don't resonate with the soul very well. But they can be used, like Beethoven used them a lot. But always for a resolution, right? So you can create controlled dissonances, kind of like the same way a painter would control shadow in a painting to get a better effect of chiaroscuro. So all of physics really needs to be, I think, revised with a better sort of a better filter, right? That's more coherent with the laws of nature, which are provably so. And that you could see that people like some of the anti-Darwinists, like Karl Ernst von Baer, who was part of the German school of Keplerian scientists of the 19th century. He had an idea of a morphogenetic field in the 1830s and 40s, that there was a harmony of parts. Even Lamarck, the French scientist, had an idea of a harmony of the parts, right? How do things work together? And they were all political. And so the idea of a harmony of interests, a harmony of agriculture, of industry, of the bourgeoisie, so-called, and the masses, that there wasn't necessarily any class struggle you had to assume was built into the fabric of nature or of humanity. That, if you do things with an idea of creative change embedded in your mind, you can always have a harmony of interests, of win-win processes. That was what made America such a threat to the empire, the better America. And it was, increasingly understood as being something that was going to replace empire structures, especially after the Civil War. So, this whole randomness thing really, really screws people up. And that's why Ertugrul is awesome.
Wait. Just one quick comment before we get into Ertugrul. Just a little, just tiny, and then we can launch into it. We can talk about the bears.
What we've been waiting for.
Yes. And it's just this. It seems to be no coincidence that Albert Einstein was a highly moralistic individual, and actually spoke out about political issues in his day, and according to my perspective, held the right positions about imperial behavior, especially in the Middle East. I can't speak to what Planck thought politically, but it seems to me that this whole approach to science was also part and parcel of who he was as a human being, and his whole outlook on the correct behavior of nation states and of individuals and that whole thing. So it seems that there is a strong correlation, at least based on my understanding of Einstein's thoughts, between this kind of thinking outside the box and these harmonics and this approach to physics that speaks very much to humanistic values and non-imperial approaches to politics.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Now we can go into Ertugrul, unless you want to say anything about that.
Well, I would just say, like, a lot of people attack Max Planck because he stayed in Germany after the Nazis took over, and they say, well, look, why wasn't he like Einstein? Einstein left early on as a pacifist. Why didn't he leave? And that's a bit naive, because he was a patriot of Germany, but he didn't like the Nazis. He wanted to defend. He saw himself on the front lines defending the soul of Germany and the better traditions of Germany that were antagonistic to fascism. So he was very courageous. His son also was executed by the Nazis because his son was part of the assassination plot against Hitler in 45. Ooh. Or was it 44? It might've been 44. Anyway, he definitely imparted these principles and values into his son. And Einstein was also super moral. Like, he was part of the civil rights movement before there was a civil rights movement. He was working with Paul Robeson. He was working with Henry Wallace, advocating for an anti-imperial post-war World War II order. And people often, also attack Einstein too, frankly, for being, a promoter of world government and all of that. And I don't think that that's fair either, because he was politically naive on some levels too. Like Bertrand Russell, who was a very nefarious character in the story of world history, was able to seduce Einstein intellectually about what Israel could be, about what world government could be. And there were, world government at the time wasn't the same thing as the New World Order idea today. You had an idea in Einstein's mind and in many moral people of those days that, we need to destroy empire and have a world of harmony. Essentially, we are one world, one system, and we need to cooperate together to develop infrastructure and end hunger and poverty and create education for everybody. And, Einstein was of that view. So I just want to say, because some of your listeners might not like Einstein, I've met tons of people who think that he was like an evil tool or something in disguise, and there's a nuance there, right? Like, he made mistakes, but he was a good human being, and he devoted himself to humanity, and so did Max Planck. Yeah, if you want to talk about Ertugrul, we can do that. Sure.
Yeah, let's move on to Ertugrul, because I mean we've talked about tyranny, we've talked about inspiration, and an alternate worldview to the kind of bland, black and white,
death,
dead philosophy that we have.
Mm-hmm.
That's so prevalent today. So it was just in our show, we were just kind of so excited to find a show that was not only entertaining but actually had some substance to it, and managed to basically show another way of being. But I just want to hear what you think about the show.
I was surprised to find it as well. Like, and I was happy that you guys, because I've been trying to tell people in my network to watch this show, and
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been very successful overall. 600 episodes, or some people would say, "Oh, it's Turkish propaganda. I don't want to do that."
Yeah.
But yeah, a friend of mine in California who runs a website told me I should check it out, and I'm always looking for a way to just relax sometimes when I'm not doing political writing or lecturing. I want to just watch a show. I want to watch a movie, but far more than half the time, I'm sure you guys can identify with this. You just feel afterwards like you just wasted your time. Like, I could have done something productive, and now I just binge watched a stupid show, and I don't want to feel that regret.
Mm-hmm.
So I was happy that after a few episodes of this Ertugrul show, I'm like, okay, there's something there. There's really. And maybe what caught my attention at first was some of the cool fight scenes or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, very quickly you're like, oh, there's more to this than meets the eye. And so I was really happy that you guys also tapped into this when I started watching your Mind Matters show. And I think that there's I never thought that I would watch 600 episodes and be like at the end, oh man, it's over.
Yeah.
Never thought I would say that, but there it happened. Yeah, it's quite the phenomenon, eh?
Yeah,
quite the phenomenon.
Just a few of the aspects. I can't remember how much we spoke about them in detail when we talked about the show, but the things that stick out in mind, just immediately, are first I mentioned tyranny and inspiration as my lead into this topic. There is this strong identification of basically political evil that there can be and there is something wrong often with a certain status quo, or the way things are, the nature of the leadership, and that there is an ideal. Like a lot of people get written off as dreamers, or John Lennon Imagine type people if they even look at the world and have any criticism of it, or look at the state of things, or criticize governments. And there's all kinds of attitudes like that. But in Ertugrul, you have just a stark reality of what's going on, and then you have this character, and not just one character, but a character with allies. You can say a community of people who have this ideal, have this. First they have a clarity of vision to see what the reality on the ground is, but also a religious ideal in this case of what things could be, and just a total determination and motivation and commitment. That's the word I'm looking for. A commitment to getting to it and to not be corrupted along the way. And I think we're still only on on season 3, so we're weaving our way through it. But that's just one of the remarkable aspects of the show, and they're able to do it, I think, because there are so many episodes. You have the opportunity to travel this meandering path through this dark forest of treachery and betrayal and new challenges and higher level bosses, it's pretty remarkable to see it play out. It's inspiring. It's inspired, and it's inspiring to watch. And like you said, it's got some great battle scenes too.
Yeah. And I guess, yeah, it might be useful because maybe some of your viewers haven't seen the previous shows or haven't watched Ertugrul, but just
Go
to
ahead.
say, yeah, this is a show which was, I think it was started in 2014. It's a Turkish show, founded on Netflix. And it basically is a quasi-historic account of the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Osman. So the father of Osman was a figure named Ertugrul. Now, there's not very much data available about who Ertugrul was, so there's a lot of leeway, a lot of flexibility creatively for the writers to go in and really just create an epic, with a lot of drama. And the thing that I found really fresh about this show is that it doesn't stagnate. Like it goes through. I'm always used to waiting for a show to lose its creative vitality, where like The Simpsons, or something, where at a certain point, like this is just randomness. They're not thinking anymore. There's no more funniness. But it doesn't. They continuously find ways to introduce new types of organizing principles and new types of components of the human persona that are embedded in the characters that come into the show over time and the scenarios that arise. So there's a constant rejuvenation or freshness with it, which I guess this resurrection idea, this Renaissance idea is part of the title of the show itself, which is nice that they're actually following their own title, where they're reviving that spirit, which is, I think, what any type of healthy society to function. There's no formula for success of a republic, or but you have to constantly, every generation, revive the vitality that gave rise to those people who sacrificed, as the founding fathers are concerned. And if you lose that and people stagnate too much, the society loses its moral fitness to survive and thrive, and it will be corrupted, and it will be taken down in the political realities that we face. So the fact that, there's a lot embedded in this show, but as you pointed out, there's political insights. Knowing a little bit about how world history actually is shaped, the fact that we have a respect for the group dynamics of the Mongols, of their what organized that part of society historically for hundreds of years, as one dynamic that Ertugrul is sort of navigating through as one of many Turkish tribes trying to create, they're Islamic, and they're trying to create a society where they define their vision for.
Oh, just wait. We lost you, Matt. Lost your audio. Just wait.
Is that better?
Oh, yeah, yep, you're back.
Okay, just went on strike for some reason.
Okay. So you're talking about the Mongols and.
Yeah, like so the fact that you have a society where these Turkish, Ertugrul is leading a Turkish tribe and charting out a vision of a world where, yes, he's Islamic, but his idea of it isn't like this Islamic State stuff. It's a world where justice is done, and the strong defend the weak, and you have certain characters within it, like Ibn Arabi, who's this character that comes and goes and always introduces these higher enlightened lessons that God, to rule a society justly, requires that we respect science and that we have economic development for the poor. These are ideas that are infused within the series as it goes on. So there's a certain truthful organizing, like it's true, no matter what type of society you are, whether it's Christian or Muslim or Jewish society, to be in alignment with natural law, you have to do these things. You have to defend justice. You have to see yourself as an instrument of God's will, like Henry VII did, or Louis XI, that we discussed earlier today. Yep. And the fact that you have him running up against these cultish Templars and these other subcults of secret societies within the Byzantine Empire. And sure, like I've encountered, obviously, like part of me is uncomfortable sometimes the way that, Christianity is sometimes treated a little bit too unidimensionally, like all of the bad guys who don't have too much complexity are all like,
of course they have the theme music,
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, that's not too classy. But at the same time, it's not totally anti-Christian either, because there's many good Christians within the show too, who are betrayed by bad Christians.
Yes.
So it's kind of like what Shakespeare does in The Merchant of Venice. Like, yeah, Shakespeare is speaking to a Christian audience, and people say, oh, it's an anti-Semitic play. But it's not that Shylock is bad because he's a Jew. He's bad because he's a bad human being, and he happens to be a Jewish banker. But there's also good Jews. His daughter, another Jewish character. They're good. They're horrified by what Shylock is doing. So Shakespeare, unlike his detractors, is not actually being anti-Jewish. He's being anti-bad people. And they happens to be that, they're cloaked often in, the case of Shylock. He's a Jewish antagonist. And in the case of Tekfur Aries or many of the characters, they're cloaked in the Christian cloth. But at the same time, you have also an idea of transformation, of redemption, which is, again, a powerful part of the human experience. It's, if anything, what makes us human is our power to not just be corrupted, which is what I think today most cynical people tend to think of as like, oh yeah, what makes a human being special? What makes us different from other animals? It's like, well, we're corrupt. Animals are just pure. It's like, well, okay. They're willing to accept that a good person can be corrupt very easily, but the idea that corrupt people can become good, people have a much more difficult time, I think, contemplating that seriously. But that's been our human history as well. And you can't account for most of universal history if you don't realize this. And they get at that. There's many characters within, from the Mongols, from these Templar affiliated nut jobs, who actually change and become good people. So that's difficult to do. That's not an easy thing to accomplish. And the only time I had ever seen that done is either in certain classical works like the Bible, where you have characters like Saul become Paul on the road to Damascus, and he goes from being like a sociopathic, not even sociopathic, because he is morally, I guess, driven to kill Christians as a warrior of the Pharisees. But he kills a lot of fucking people, and he really is unredemptive. He thinks he's totally right about that until he has this moment of transformation, and ends up becoming an advocate of Christ's message in the Bible. And before that, you have some examples of the Furies in Sophocles' plays, who become the Erinyes at the end of the Orestes trilogy. So, these terrible vendetta-seeking rage ball quasi deities who are just like chasing poor, Orestes. He made some bad mistakes, but they're like pursuing him, and these are ugly creatures. And by the end, it's resolved beautifully, where they're transformed by Athena into the Erinyes. And so you have examples of that in great, Western, the classical matrix, which are great, but we haven't seen a lot of that. I haven't seen any of that in the last, 100 years of Western literature. I can't think of any examples where that happens, but they do that in this Turkish show.
Well, one of the things that we discussed a little bit, trying not to give too many spoilers on that show, was the transformation of one character in particular. And we were all it was dramatically so convincing. It was so well done from beginning to end.
And you wouldn't have been able to predict it from the beginning. There's like, no, this character there's irredeemable. I'm never going to like her.
and you're going from really like seething with disgust at her behavior to 40 episodes later cheering her on and celebrating her newfound elevation, in the eyes of God and herself and her tribe and everything. And it was so exactly what you mentioned, Matthew. I mean, I didn't remember seeing anything like that in any other program. And it keeps, like you said, I mean, there is the story revitalizes itself constantly. There is this, a resurrection of values, and people consolidate their vision again and again to rally their, what the tribe wants to accomplish under the leadership of Ertugrul. And it's you laugh, you cry, there's you enjoy the battles, all of the emotions come up in this story.
Well, there was one. There's a couple of characters in mind that I've seen kind of do this switcheroo, and that was from Dragon Ball Z. There was a couple of characters. There was Vegeta and Piccolo. Yeah, I'm a nerd. And also in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, there was Spike. People always forget about Spike, but he was just absolutely horrible and horrendous. And then he goes through the very painful process of fighting for his soul in a literal way, and then redeems himself as being one of the strongest, group in the fight to save humanity. It's a lot. It's not nearly as satisfying as some of the transformations in Ertugrul, just because it's a different show. I mean,
and it's a fantasy.
It's a fantasy. And so they don't really have, and it's a lot shorter. They don't have 30 episodes to really explore, the kind of personal dimensions of character dynamics and everything that Ertugrul does. So, I really liked those transformations from before. So then when we started watching this show and we started seeing these kinds of transformations, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what, I was wanting to see in these other ones, but they couldn't never do it. And so when I saw it with this one, it was I think what I actually said at the time was this was the most satisfying transformation I have ever seen.
Yeah.
And
no,
it was
a great
just
because also as a as a geek, I got to say, you have cases in Marvel comics too. You've got cases. I used to read a lot of comic books in the day. And Venom at various points actually walks a good path, and you have different characters like Magneto for storylines coming in and changing his ways and defending the good. And there's many characters and many case studies in comic books. And I think the thing that makes the Ertugrul transformation so satisfying is that it's unlike the comic book culture. I think they tend to the motive for why characters do good tends to be reduced to some combination of revenge, guilt for letting Uncle Ben die, or there's something Kantian usually underlying the motive for a lot of the good guys, and that includes also there's a certain lack of depth for the reasons why we do good or why we change from being bad to good, which doesn't take into consideration the full depth of the human condition. Whereas I think what makes the Ertugrul transformations so satisfying in that show is that they're really doing things for the realization that there's something about the health of their soul and something that they were lacking by not walking on God's path, by living in dissonance from the actual will of God, and the will of the universe, this creative force of the universe, however you want to take it, which I think it makes the more durable good guys happen. When you look at people who are just willing to just succumb, like Lincoln or whatever, to just their, to dying and to putting their lives at great risk for the sake of their ideals, they're doing it not for any Kantian reason. They really are happy people, and they love life, but they love the health of their soul so much more than the safety of their body. That's why Socrates was able to willingly and happily take the hemlock, because he knew that life really wasn't living if I was going to disobey. If I was going to do something to make my soul more ugly, more unhealthy by disobeying my conscience or whatever. And Cicero did the same. So many of that's something which we used to, I think, understand more in the West as a part of the human experience and the human psyche. And under the last century of Freudian sort of interpretations of the psyche and Darwinian interpretations of evolution, we've sort of lost that eternal sense of what is the soul, what is it that makes us eternal, or that ties us to the eternal and the divine.
The higher connections have just been completely severed.
And it's very clear in the Ertugrul, and Ertugrul sort of represents himself like a really integrated person, where there's no conflict with his ideals and his desires. So his his obligations and his will are so in tune that accompanies these profound insights that other people can't understand, because they're still living. They have their godly ideals, but they still live as individuals day to day for personal comfort, or local, more reduced secondary concerns, which are at odds and dissonant with their principles. So they don't have that insight. They don't have the ability to have that confidence, the courage, and that penetrating power to see through processes and conspiracies the way an Ertugrul has, and they're very mystified by it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another really, really great.
Damn, Ertugrul always with his schemes and trying to be greedy, and that's how they see it anyway.
Exactly.
The image from the show that came to mind as you were speaking there, Matt, was Ertugrul as this integrated character. And one of the things that just it gets me every time, like it really brings a tear to my eye, and it's happened several times, is where Ertugrul is trapped, or he's at the end of his ropes, and basically someone's holding a sword to his throat. So this is the moment where he's going to die, right? And of course we know he's not going to die in the show because it's his show. But every time that he's facing death, the actor's so great. He's completely calm in the face of death, and he just recites what's the Islamic line called? Is it the Shahada, or is it something else that they recite before death? Before they die. Well, he recites that
Muhammad is the messenger, and there's one God but Allah. Yeah.
Yep. Right. And so he recites the line, and he's just got this completely serene acceptance of death on his face. Like he's willing to die at any moment, and with total confidence and no fear. And that's another thing that you don't see elsewhere, really. I mean, you see, kind of like in the comic books, you might see a facsimile of it. You might see like a tough Marvel superhero character or something that's getting in a situation and facing death, but it doesn't pack a punch for some reason. Whereas this, it's totally human and totally believable and totally inspiring at the same time to see that combination of, how did you put it, of like obligation and will, and where there's just a totally unified human being who almost like we've talked about Ibn Arabi on the show, and we've talked about mysticism, we've talked about stoicism, but essentially this stoic sage, this totally integrated person who nothing can take that away from them, and can take that purity of heart away from them. So
they're like really sovereign, and I think that's the paradox of like in the case of the United States. One of the things that's always been the battle in the U.S. is to resolve the general welfare principle of the Constitution with the sacredness of the individual, and they're both beautiful, right? Like to actually have a nation enshrining the sacredness of individual liberty that had never been done before the United States Declaration of Independence. And then to have the Constitution with its preamble that asserts that the entire society and the laws must be read from the filter that everything must be adherent to the general welfare of the whole. They seem to represent two different opposing ideas that a lot of people have not been able to resolve properly, which is why they often will characterize Lincoln or JFK, who believed in big government, as being tyrannical because they abused certain individual liberties to do whatever we want to do. Or Hamilton, they'll do the same thing there. Or the inverse, they will, consider anybody who just cares about individual rights as being just selfish. And this is we see that with a lot of the COVID arguments today, like, oh, you care about your individual rights and not wanting to get a vaccine. Aren't you selfish? Like that, then you got that other distortion. Mm-hmm. So there's been this inability to sort of resolve the two properly, but that's the precondition for sovereignty. So in America, what made the United States so powerful is that it was a nation where everybody was seen as sovereign. It wasn't like you had one. Formerly, the idea of sovereign was the sovereign, right? The monarch that was born into a hereditary master class was the sovereign, and rights sort of trickled down from the will of the sovereign that could be taken away or given as that sovereign saw fit. To have a whole society of every sovereign citizen being the source of a nation ruled by the consent of the governed, right? That's a democratic republic. It doesn't mean that every single decision is going to be made by everybody in the society, but you have to have that sort of development where everybody cares. Everybody sees themselves as responsible for the orientation of their society, regardless of what party you find yourself in. So you have to both care about the sacredness of your individual, but you also have to care about the whole. You have to be willing to make sacrifices when they're needed objectively, but you also have to be able to reasonably discern what are legitimate sacrifices versus illegitimate sacrifices too, right? That has to be, so the cultivation of all the mind, the emotions, and the body all have to be happening together. And so Ertugrul really exemplifies that. There's very little, I mean, that's like sort of the best role model, which is why I think it brings tears to our eyes to see him in action, because you're like, okay, that's what a human being is supposed to be. And maybe it's like nobody's ever going to achieve that maybe level of integration, perhaps. Maybe that's a little bit too high to expect everybody to attain, but still, like, it's something natural is there. And we haven't seen so much, but we've been hungry and thirsty for it, being in a drought of morality that we were born into, that, like, you see a bit of oxygen after you've been underwater, you're like,
that's what it's like.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And it's so funny. It's what is it? Well, I want, just like you, when we started talking about this, you said you tried to introduce some friends to it and haven't been very successful. It's like, I really want you to watch this show about a 13th century Turkic nomad group, trying to establish, an Islamic, Islamic world empire, essentially, and it's really great, and it's a hard sell.
It's about traditional values.
Yeah, but if you can get over that and just watch it, you'll find that it's actually got quite a lot to it, and to the point where I haven't found, except like you said, Matt, about some of the kind of cartoonish depictions of the evil Christians, right? Aside from that, there's absolutely nothing really offensive about it, No,
absolutely.
I mean, it's got a few groan-worthy like plot devices and stuff every once in a while, but that just for me, it's more of the fun, actually.
No, yeah, and it does, I think, by introducing a sane approach to how conspiracies actually happen. It gives you a lot of insights into your own world and how do you actually think. It's not this like Fight Club version of conspiracy theories, which is how people often tend to disrespect conspiracy theories. Is like, oh yeah, it's like Fight Club, like everybody is literally in on it, right? And no, there's like layers of subterfuge and dynamic that Ertugrul is constantly navigating through and operating on a counterintelligence level. And when you actually look at history from the standpoint of counterintelligence, from both the good guys and the bad guys, you look at Benjamin Franklin subverting and infiltrating the Hellfire Clubs of London and bringing in intel back to his network in the United States on Isaac Newton and Bernard Mandeville and all these things. Like there's layers that they're setting up traps. Ben Franklin is the master of deception, of constantly getting his enemies to think he's going to do one thing and he does another thing. And he's already set you up he's already operating 80 steps in the future and setting up all these different contingency plans, which is where, I did this class a little while ago. I don't want to talk about the class right now, but I'm just going to throw it out there as a teaser on, one of his key allies is a figure that he brings in from Pennsylvania, and he sets him up as a painter with certain networks that he's cultivated in the Lunar Society in Britain, which is also behind the creation of the industrial activity of Manchester that gives rise to the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It was ironically Ben Franklin doing that, an American. It wasn't anything indigenous to the British Empire. And he has networks like Joseph Wright of Derby, who's a great painter in Britain, part of the Lunar Society. Joseph Priestley is another one. Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's grandfather, who's actually a really good guy, was also a part of that. And Benjamin West is brought into this network and ends up creating the British Royal Academy of Fine Arts to create a cultural revolution to bring back the best anti-imperial cultural and aesthetical traditions into Britain itself, which totally flanks the empire. Like, they didn't expect any of that stuff to happen, and he's doing this 15 years before the American Revolution. He's planting tons of seeds. And his discovery of electricity is integrated into his future plans for not just a revolution in science, but it was the creation of the Republic was part and parcel of his designs for discovering the nature of electricity, harnessing it, and sharing it. So you have characters like that. And so the fact that Ertugrul, people have, I've seen criticisms online of people saying, oh, nobody could think like Ertugrul, like he's always on top of things, he's always 10 steps ahead. It's like, that's part of our history, like that people operate that way.
Well, and I'd just say kind of a hard no to that, because in the first season, like, they're always getting trapped and they're falling for all the traps. And it's Ertugrul's actually learning from each of those new lessons, like new traps, basically. Like, once he's been trapped once or twice using the same method, it's not going to happen again unless the bad guys up their game. So he's constantly learning. And so, like, that was one of the things that kind of annoyed me during the first season. I'm like, oh, all these ambushes, they're always working all the time. When are they going to learn? And then, season 2 comes around, and, okay, they've learned, and and some people just have that level of, like, just on the level on the topic of that level of insight, because oftentimes people will be saying, oh, what's going on here? And Ertugrul will say, well, it's obvious. This person's thinking this, and he wants to do this because this, and he lays it all out, and that's, of course, what's happened. But there are people like that, just like you're saying. Like, there are people in history, and it's just, some people are just that insightful about what's going on and how to read people's motivations and how to see the dynamics that aren't obvious on the surface of things.
Exactly. It's the motives. Like, they're looking on the domain of what is organized in that person's heart. And that there's almost like a species character, like a cat will be a cat. No matter what scenario you put it in, it'll be a cat. It's not going to start, flying like a bird, for the most part. So it's kind of, human beings are kind of like that too. There's certain personality types that, if you haven't resolved certain things or you believe certain things, then I can put you in no matter what scenario, and you will have certain preordained or predetermined reactions and impulses according to that you will react according to. And this is what, Shakespeare as well, he's trying to get us to understand this by introducing characters like Iago in Othello, and Iago is a master intelligence sort of archetype from representing Venice. And Othello is a Moorish general who's operating for the Venetian army. He's got a lot of successes under his belt. He's seen as a really great man, and he's got a lot of virtues. But he also has a problem where he really believes that honest Iago, his close friend, really is trustworthy. He has a reputation, right, of being just the most trustworthy guy. And Iago is just animated by very nefarious intentions that Othello and others cannot see. And he's able to profile everybody so that he knows how they're going to react when he plants certain seeds of inside their minds, whether it's jealousy that, hey, I heard your wife Desdemona is having a thing with your other buddy, forgot his name. And he's able to just sort of, as soon as he awakens the jealousy and the insecurity that he's identified is there within Othello as, a black man from Africa, operating in a European world, he's got a lot of insecurities, a lot of prejudices against him, and he's able to capitalize on those things to get Othello to just completely go against his own better nature and act very tragically. And I'm not going to spoil it for people who haven't read the play, but yeah, like, Shakespeare is definitely trying to get us to understand how humanity is organized by group dynamics, which is an expression of individual psychology, and how the empire utilizes their knowledge of these things to maintain their control by getting their victims to divide and be conquered, to fight each other and destroy each other. Where in reality, our true interest is in working together, regardless of our different cultures and religions and whatever. We have universal characteristics that every time that society has organized themselves to operate on what makes us human, which is that we all know we're going to die. We're the only species that's self-conscious of our mortality long before it happens. It's built into our awareness of our existence, which then opens up the door to the next question, which is, well, what's the purpose of our existence? What's the purpose of our happiness, of legitimate higher happiness versus lower order ephemeral happiness that could lead to destruction? What are the universal sentiments that we should cultivate and try to feed more and not feed the lower order sentiments that bring us into self-destruction? Mm-hmm. So all of these things are parts of, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Jew, whether you're Hindu, whether you're atheist, whatever, those are just parts of human nature. And empires will capitalize on their knowledge of that to exploit. And great leaders like Ben Franklin, or Colbert, or you name it. I think Putin and Xi Jinping today are operating on by leading the win-win, the idea of win-win cooperation, guiding the multipolar alliance and the Eurasian alliance. I think that they very much have tapped into that source, even though we're seeing certain strategic decisions that are maybe not wise coming out of China lately. I think overall they're operating on that paradigm, with the Christian cultural matrix of Putin and anybody. They're basically saying everybody can join us with big projects for win-win, advantage to everybody orientations, which is really good. And I think that scares the hell out of the empire, which is why I think also they're fueling so many flames of prejudice in the pro-Trump support base right now, which is, falling prey to fearing any type of big government. There's a hyper radical libertarianism that I think has embedded itself philosophically into a lot of the pro-Trump patriots, who see everything big government as being evil. So they see China, which is central government, and they just see it as evil. So they're very easily falling prey to the idea that, oh yeah, it's not British intelligence running the color revolution in America. It's really, China and Venezuela. It's like, whoa, like, calm down. You're skipping steps here. There's another causal Iago that's not China running around starting fires.
Well, that's interesting that you go into that direction, because that's something I wanted to discuss with you at some point as well. But that is a whole conversation in and of
maybe
itself.
we should save that for a future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we're going. We've already gone an hour and 45 minutes or something like that. So I think,
and I feel we can go another hour and 45 minutes without any issue. But I just wanted to say, Matt, what a pleasure it is to speak with you today. And like I said, I mean, we could, and I hope we do sometime in the near future, get together again and discuss a lot of the topics that you cover in your articles and in your lectures that we didn't get to discuss today. You're like, I was thinking at one point, I wish I had this guy as my professor in college, because you're one of your gifts, and of course there's a lot of hard work behind it, is all this research you put in creating context within context within context, and it's wonderful. So, tipping my hat to you, my friend.
I mean,
I do want to just remind our viewers that you can catch a lot of Matthew's articles on Sott. A lot of them are originally posted at thecanadianpatriot.org and the risingtidefoundation.net. Your work is also seen on Strategic Culture Foundation website, as well as a few others, I think. Yeah,
Fort Roos, Duran, probably a lot of people probably repost your stuff.
Right? Yeah, that's the thing in the alternative media world. As soon as you post it somewhere, often it finds
goes
itself
everywhere.
On 1,000 other sites. Yeah, but honestly, guys, like, thank you very much for having this show. I don't think that this type of content and discussion happens. I don't know where else it would be able to happen other than on a show like yours. It's great that you've made a platform for this type of dialogue to occur.
Great,
thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And anytime, you want to continue a dialogue, let me know. I'd be happy to join you guys.
Yeah,
that's a near guarantee.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks again, Matt.
Thank you.
Take care. We'll be in touch.
For sure. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Okay.